Okay, it's a few minutes after 5, so why don't we get started? So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second session on this really excellent series from our friend and colleague Mark Schenker on the Iliad. I'm going to get done with this intro quick because we have a lot to cover. The only thing I want to remind you is to use the Q&A button at the bottom. That's right, you should see it right near your chat button. If you want to send any questions, they'll be sent to me, and I'll relay them to Mark at the end to the extent we have time. And remember, he's always more than happy to respond to direct questions if you send them to him. And I'm happy to give anybody his email address at any time. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark and enjoy the program, and then we'll also.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for attending. And if you attended last time, thank you for that as well. Michael, you're frozen. Are we live? I'll assume we are. So I will say, having done programming of films and literature in libraries and other venues for over 30 years, the enemy of attendance is either very bad weather, because people don't want to drive to the site, or very good weather because people want to drive to somewhere else. So I thank you all for showing up on this lovely pre-spring day. Last time I stressed this sentence: if you remember nothing else from these talks of mine, I hope you remember this. The Iliad is a magnificent anti-war war poem. And in exchanges after the fact, at least one person wanted to suggest that it was a war poem. And I want to say that I'm not arguing that it's not a war poem, quite the opposite. I want to say that it is a war poem and an anti-war poem at the same time. That, I think, is the essence of the Iliad. It is a magnificent anti-war war poem. And this both and, rather than either or, is critical, I think, to an appreciation of Homer's epic. I also want to remind you, without going into detail, that some of the motifs that I have looked at and will return to are the idea of the macro and the micro, the broad expanse and the narrow focus. You can think of the fact that we have a battle in book 8, but we have an embassy to Odysseus, to Achilles in number 9, in book 9, which is much more micro. We have the spy mission in book 10, which is very narrow and focused. So macro and micro, the whole theme of nostos, this idea of returning home, very powerful in Greek literature. Joyce informally referred to the third section of Ulysses as the nostos. The plural is nostoi, N-O-S-T-O-I. Very, very important idea. We get our word nostalgia, which was coined in 1688. Originally, it was a medical diagnosis, nosta from longing for home, and algia from pain, like neuralgia. A diagnosis in the late 17th century for someone whose longing for the past was so strong, it was debilitating, nostalgia. Epic similes we'll continue to look at throughout the entire series of lectures. I made the point last time of how they work. I won't repeat that here, but I'll be giving you more examples this evening and next time and the time after. And I also want you to keep in mind equivalences in the poem, equivalences between apparent opposites or contrasts. There are some equivalences that we might call static or parallel, as when right after we're told of the Greeks' nighttime spy mission in book 10, we learn that Hector has proposed a similar mission and is accepted by the volunteer Dolon to undertake such a mission into the Greeks area at the same time. So equivalent but parallel. And some equivalences in the epic might be deemed dynamic in that they involve reversals, movement, as when the tide of war changes in the section we're looking at this evening, where the Greeks are dominant, and then they have the Trojan surge by the end of book 12, when they are attacking the Greeks in a reversal of the expected siege of Troy. So one idea that I want to talk about this evening is glory, a word that if you're in the Fagles translation, you encounter many, many times. It's possible in other translations they use other words. But while the mythologies of some cultures focus on the way the world will end, Greek mythology does not. It tends to look back at the past in order to focus on the present. Greek religious thought held that after death, the individual disappeared into an underworld where existence was without any meaning. Although some people believed there might be rewards and punishment in an afterlife, most apparently did not, and it did not inform literary culture, the idea of your reward in some afterlife. Instead, the focus was on something called time, T-I-M-E with an accent on the last E, which is translated roughly as respectability, which is associated with worldly honors in the form of wealth and the spoils of war, like taking a woman, as Achilles does, and then having her removed as a war prize and setting off the entire spat that informs the Iliad. One focus on your reward is in this life, material goods associated with respectability, your status. And much more important was the idea of kleos, K-L-E-O-S, kleos. It's actually the Cleo in Cleopatra, where kleos means what others hear about you or your renown. And in Cleopatra, the patra is father. The Greek phrase, the Greek word kleos, that idea, is roughly translated into what we would call renown or glory, how your reputation, not your status, your reputation, continues after your death. It's important to distinguish that time is associated with the material world, while kleos, ideally, is imperishable. The Greeks have a word for it. I'll spell it for those of you who are writing this down. It's A-P-H-T-H-I-T-O-N, aphthiton. You can drop that into the dinner conversation sometime. Very few things in Homer are referred to as actually imperishable, because the gods are really the only things that are imperishable, but it is used a handful of times in the epic. In the years that followed Homer's age, individualism grew to a broader concern for the glory of, the individual ethos of these warriors in the epic gave way to a broader concern for glory for one's city-state, rather than the individual citizen soldier, the hoplite. And kleos was then sought not for the individual warrior, but for the city-state. That hasn't happened yet in this poem. And these warriors are not so much fighting for the abstraction of Greece, even though they may invoke their fatherland. They're fighting for their own glory. Part of Achilles' tragedy, and we have to remember, he's a tragic hero. Hector is a pathetic hero, one we feel sorry for. Odysseus is a comic hero in his own poem. That is, he gets home, he gets a wife, regains her, he gets a prize, his kingdom, and other things. It's a happy ending. In Achilles' tragedy, part of it is, as he reveals to Odysseus in book 9, in the lines 497 to 505 in the Fagles translation, that he is fated to lose either Nostos, homecoming, or Kleos, fame. What makes him a tragic hero is there are two things and he can't have both. George Eliot, in an excellent essay called The Moral of the Antigone, a play by Sophocles, said the tragedy is not a conflict between a right and a wrong, it's a conflict between two rights, which is what makes it tragic. So he says, Achilles to Odysseus, mother tells me, the immortal goddess Thetis with her glistening feet, that two fates bear me on to the day of death. If I hold out here and I lay siege to Troy, my journey home is gone, but my glory never died. If I voyage back to the fatherland I love, my pride, my glory dies, true, but the life that's left to me will be long. The stroke of death will not come on me quickly. That's the tragic nexus or not that cannot be unbroken. He has to choose. Consider that for Odysseus, the comic hero, his Nostos is his Kleos. His getting home is his glory. And although he is buffeted and suffers greatly, and you may think of his story as tragic, he surmounts everything and his ending is happy, not just because he gets the comic markers of a mate, an inheritance or material prize, but he also gets glory. He is famed for having come home. So thematically, the concept of homecoming is much explored in ancient Greek literature, especially in the post-war homeward fortunes experienced by Menelaus, Agamemnon, and Odysseus. One reason for this is geography. The Greeks were constantly involved in seafaring, whether for warfare or for exploration, or more typically for commerce. One of the reasons I believe that the Greeks invented a lot of Western civilization and the Olympics was because they had access to lots of different cultures coming through, and they're going to lots of different cultures. They were also blessed with a hospitable environment. If you're in Athens, you might think of having men wrestle naked outside. If you're in Stockholm, maybe not so much. So the Greeks gave us the Olympics, and Northern Europe gave us Calvinism, I like to say. In any event, so I do want you to keep in mind these general points about macro, micro, nostos, epic similes I'll point out to you, and some parallels. So in book 7, a truce is called so that both sides may bury their dead. In silence, this is the Greeks, they pile the corpses on the pyre. I'm sorry, I'll back up. This is the Trojans burying their dead. In silence, they pile the corpses on the pyre, their hearts breaking, burn them down to ash, and return to sacred Troy. And just so on the other side, Achaean men-at-arms pile the corpses on the pyre, their hearts breaking, burn them down to ash, and return to the hollowed ships. That's book 7, lines 494 following on page 228. The language is identical, not just parallel. And that's an example of that static kind of equivalence. Notice the importance of the ritual of burning your dead trumps or overrides the need to have a battle. There's a truce. Shortly after, each of the two sides holds a feast. The Achaean soldiers brought their rations, some with bronze and some with gleaming iron, some with hides, some with whole live cattle, some with slaves, and they made a handsome feast. Then all that night, the long-haired Achaeans feasted as Trojans and Trojan allies took their meal in Troy. And that's book 7, lines 545 and following on page 230. So that's the emphasis on parallel equivalences. Book 8 is given over to battle. It is a war poem, and we're told that quickly the long-haired Achaeans took their meal throughout the shelters, then they armed at once. And on their side, the Trojans put on harness too, mustering throughout the city a smaller force, but nerved to engage in combat even so. And that's book 8, line 63 following on page 233. I could give endless examples of this and I won't. The point is, this is a poet who is humane and has a broader view of the matter than mere partisanship. So often what happens on one side happens on the other. More interesting, I think, is to think about the use of similes. I mentioned last time that a simile is marked by a like or as or than, THAN, a comparison word. They are considered more primitive than metaphors because they're more obvious. It is a marker of primitive literature, by all I which mean to say is literature early in the development of civilization, not inferior literature. That primitive literature reveals that a comparison is being made, and so you're more often to find them in the Aeneid, the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Old Testament, because the poets want to show you what they're doing. So upbraided by Hera in book 8 and inspired by a sign from Zeus, the Greeks, quote, roused their warlust and flung themselves on the Trojans with a vengeance. That's book 8, line 288, following page 239. The poem then lists 8 Greek warriors by name and observes that Teucer, Teucer, Teucer came up ninth, tensing his reflex bow and lurking under the wall of giant Ajax's shield. As Ajax raised the rim, the archer, that is Teucer, would mark a target, shoot through the lines, and the man he hit dropped dead on the spot. And quick as a youngster duckling, under his mother's skirts, he'd duck under Ajax's shield, and the gleaming shield would hide him head to toe. That comparison of this archer hiding behind a shield, sneaking out, shooting and going back, is decidedly unheroic in both senses of not courageous and not typical of Homer's verse. The comparison to a younger duckling is not meant to work to the archer's advantage, especially in a poem that's filled with lots of heroes and heroic language. There are similarly unheroic similes in book 9, and again, birds are involved. This is the episode where Agamemnon has sent an embassy of Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix to persuade Achilles to put aside his anger and his pride and rejoin the fight. So again, it's not every other book, but this alternation between battle scenes and more intimate scenes. In dismissing that embassy, Achilles contrasts his direct style with their attempts at diplomacy, which he finds demeaning to him and to them, and describes them as crowding around him, quote, one after another, coaxing like a murmuring clutch of doves. That's book 9, line 376 and following on page 261. What's striking here is that is not the language of Homer, who was describing the archer as a duckling. That's Achilles dissing them by comparing them to doves, a murmuring clutch of doves. And a few lines later, he argues that he has been unrewarded for his efforts and his hardships, quote, like a mother bird hurrying morsels back to her unfledged young, whatever she can catch, but it's all starvation wages for herself. Then a new line, so for me. That is so powerful and so filled with venom. I'm going to read that again so that you appreciate in this very testosterone-filled poem, loaded with physical prowess and martial arts, that this comparison, not just to a bird, but a mother bird, like a mother bird hurrying morsels back to her unfledged young, whatever she can catch, but it's all starvation wages for herself. So for me, you can hear the bitterness in that that's a 3-word line that's portioned out by itself. And of course, that's the typical epic simile. Like what I'm talking about outside the poem, there's no mother bird actually in Achilles' tent. That's what the poet has imported in. It's called a vehicle. And then turning back briefly to so for me. It degrades them and it expresses his own anger at his degradation because it's a bird and it's female. I want to say this is what interests me supremely about the Iliad, much more than conversations about the gods and how supernaturalism works. The humanity of this great poem can be found in the language and the metaphors and similes. And again, metaphors are harder to find. I said last time, if someone says, don't cry over spilt milk, and you don't know that expression, you're looking around for milk when there is none. But if someone says to you, you're acting like you've just drunk a lot of milk, you know something's being compared to something else. If you have the measure of somebody's metaphorical language, you have an insight, if not into their character, at least the character of their culture. So book 8, a third of the way through the poem, and I'll remind you that the reason the Iliad has 24 books is the same reason the Odyssey has 24 books. It's because that's the number of letters in the Greek alphabet. Because Joyce, the polymath, knew that when he set out to write Ulysses, he gave it 18 chapters because that's how many letters there are in the Gaelic alphabet, even though he couldn't read Gaelic. He wanted to be as Homer-like as possible. So book 8, a third of the way through the epic, has the spirits of the Trojans soaring, and it ends with striking brightness. And I'm going to extract from about 15 lines at the very end of the poem. So for those of you who want to see it, it's book 8, line 639 and following, the end of the section. But I am only going to read selected phrases so that we don't use up the time. The watchfires blazed among them, the stars in the night sky glittering round the moon's brilliance blaze. Bright air and all the stars shine clear. So many fires burned. The men of Troy bright against their walls. 1,000 fires were burning there on the plain. Beside each fire sat 50 fighting men, poised in the leaping blaze. And champing oats and glistening barley, stallions waited for dawn to mount her glowing throne. You need sunglasses to read that passage. And the striking thing is we expect watchfires to blaze. The moon's brilliance sometimes blaze, stars shine, fires burn, but we don't expect that in the midst of all this, even the barley is going to glisten. Even the barley that is being fed to the horses who are waiting for dawn to mount her glowing throne, even the barley glistens. That's the brilliance, pun intended, of Homer, that his eye sees the glistening of the barley as well as the moon's brilliant blaze. Book 9 is another alternative here to the battle. It opens with the Achaeans racked by panic and struck, we're told, by grief that is too much to bear. They are losing. In response, Agamemnon, completely despairing, uses the same language that he employed in book 2 when he was unsuccessful with his reverse psychology ploy. And if you weren't here last time or you've forgotten, the 3 lines I'm about to read to you, they're from book 9, line 30 and following, page 252. The 3 lines are nearly identical to what he said in book 2 a long time ago, 7 books earlier in the poem. There, he said it so that the men would say, no, we don't want to go home. What are you kidding? We want to fight. And much to his dismay, when he uses these lines to say, you know what, we should forget about this and go home. In book 2, they say, good idea. Here, the irony is that he actually is demoralized. He says, in this time, same language, so come, follow my orders. Obey me, all you Argives. Cut and run. Sail home to the fatherland we love. We'll never take the broad streets of Troy. In this instance, in the first instance, it's Odysseus who reassures and rallies the Greek army when, surprisingly, they think that's a good idea. The upper administrators of the Greeks were thinking that the Greeks would argue and say, no, we'll have none of that. Here, in book 9, it is Diomedes, who's called Lord of the War Cry, who intervenes, setting the stage for the pairing of Diomedes and Odysseus in book 10 as the spies who volunteer to enter the Trojan camp under cover of darkness. That is, Agamemnon's clout has receded a little bit here, a third of the way in the book, and it is Odysseus and Diomedes who step up to help the Greek cause. Strikingly, Diomedes tells King Agamemnon, who is truly despairing, he hails him as a desperate man. that if the king wishes to desert, that's the word, a very loaded word, then sail away, my king, he says at book 9, line 49, insisting the rest of the long-haired Achaeans will hold out right here. That's book 9, line 52, following page 253. The rest of the long-haired Achaeans will hold out right here. Now that's impressive in the sense of the switch of the moral center, the center of martial commitment to the cause, from Agamemnon to Diomedes, who is considered the fiercest of the warriors. But something else also happens that's interesting, for which you have to know Greek, which I don't. But people talk, you hear things. Tellingly, when Homer uses the phrase that Fagles translates as "will hold out right here," the Greek phrase used by Homer can mean both stay put and stay at home. That is, in Diomedes' view, the siege of Troy is as much their destiny as going home, and their engagement in this distant battle, by which they will stay put, is their way also of staying at home. That is, keeping the faith. They are where they are meant to be. And the Greeks would have picked up that difference, just as the Greek listeners to this poem would have been entertained no end to hear that what was tried in book 2 as an unsuccessful reverse psychology ploy is here used honestly when Agamemnon is despairing. And once again, his plan doesn't work because he's told by a lesser Greek, you want to go, go, we're staying put. You can imagine how much they would have enjoyed hearing the echo, and they would know the echo because the language was exactly the same. Book 10 has come to be known as the Dolonaya, the little story about a man named Dolon, D-O-L-O-N, a remarkably insignificant Trojan in his own right, but significant because of his role in this remarkable insertion in the Iliad. I say insertion because this chapter, and if you haven't read it and you don't plan to read along with us on all the chapters of the Iliad, I recommend that you might want to sample book 10 as a book worth your attention. It apparently existed in some form as a separate tale and was inserted later into the Iliad. There's great debate among many people who know more ancient Greek than I will ever know as to whether it was repaired by the Homer poet and gussied up to fit into the epic, or whether it shows its heritage through its language and form. I can't comment on that. But what's remarkable about it is that, continuing the theme of book 9 and the idea that the Greeks are losing, which is why Agamemnon has finally reached out to Achilles. Without Achilles, they're doomed. The Greeks are here described in book 10 as being in desperate straits, with their fate standing on a razor's edge. When Nestor proposes a spy mission into the Trojan camp, Diomedes, the ferocious warrior, and Odysseus, the crafty strategist, volunteer. And there's a long tradition in Western literature, not just Greek, that there's a mission like this, and what you expect is the two best men to step up. That's a long tradition of having the best in the group volunteer. So this nighttime sortie, which is sneaky rather than forthright, and has the Greek warriors wearing animal pelts. Odysseus wears a helmet made of bear tusk. You can see an example online. A very primitive pre-Bronze Age armaments, because bronze armor would shine and give their presence away at night. This whole enterprise is characterized by the scholar and translator Daniel Mendelsohn as an inversion of the norms of Homeric warfare. The reversal of Greek fortune has so far gone that it's not just military at this point, but moral. They're not acting honorably. So despite the epic simile employed to characterize the two Greeks setting out on their mission, into the black night they went like two lions, stalking through the carnage and the corpses, through piles of armor and black pools of blood. That's book 10, lines 348 following on page 286. So despite that epic simile, the two Greeks act deceitfully, both by lying in wait face down with the corpses, book 10, lines 408, page 288. They lie down face down with the corpses on the battlefield, kind of degrading position for a warrior. And also they act deceitfully when Odysseus lies, when he tells the terrified Dolon, whose teeth are chattering in his mouth, that death is your last worry. That's book 10, 448, line 289. He fears that they will kill him. Odysseus tells him, if you tell us what you want, you'll be spared. Dolon, his legs shaking underneath him, lies and says that he was duped by Hector, when in fact it was he, Dolon, who volunteered for this mission solo in the hopes of taking Achilles' chariot as a war prize. So many staples of the poem are invoked here. He's not their best, Dolon. He's a, what is the Greek word? He's a punk. He doesn't get paired with another person. He does it on his own. And he's not doing it for glory. He's doing it for war prizes. And the taking of Achilles' war prize is what sets the poem in motion. So Dolon blurts out, that's the translation of the Greek word that Fagles uses. He's constantly blurting out a wealth of information in the expectation that the two Greeks will spare his life. He tells them, so what are you going to do now? Lead me back to your ships or tie me up and gag me and leave me here? Instead, quote, with that, just as Dolon reached up for his chin to cling with a frantic hand and beg for life. So he's moving his hands up to his chin, maybe to his mouth, to supplicate. Just as he does that, Diomedes struck him square across the neck, a flashing hack of the sword. Both tendons snapped and the shrieking head went tumbling in the dust. They tore the weasel cap from the head, stripped the wolf pelt, the reflex bow, and the long, tough spear. So he too is wearing animal pelts because he's going out at night. And it's telling that he's wearing a weasel cap because he lied about being duped by Hector and what his motivation was. The weaselly Dolon comes to no good. But history has not been kind to the Greeks in this episode. In the Inferno, Dante placed Diomedes and Odysseus in the 8th circle of hell with other evil counselors because of this episode alone. In Greek literature, Odysseus is praised for his craftiness because he's a hero of the Trojan War. He was the designer of the stratagem of the Trojan horse, and he actually made it home. But as Greek literature gave way to Western literature of the Holy Roman Empire and the hegemony of Christianity, Odysseus was seen as wily, which is to say crafty, which is to say devious, which is to say devil-like. And Odysseus does not come off well in the Middle Ages, including what I just said about Dante. And so book 9 presents us with a failure in diplomacy as Agamemnon's messages are unsuccessful in rousing Achilles. And book 10 presents us with a mission that is nominally successful, the Greeks find out a lot, but based on deceit and dishonor. It is not going well for the Greeks. And in book 12, halfway through the poem, the ending has a stunning reversal as the Trojans, who are now well outside the wall of their city, threaten to breach the walls of the ramparts that the Greeks have built to protect their fleet. Try to visualize this. The Trojans, who have been protecting their fortress, have now come far out onto the plains, down to the waterside, and they're attacking at the end of Book 12. The walls that were built up to protect the Greek fleet from attack, they are sieging the city, the temporary city that's protecting the fleet. And you have this radical reversal. I talked about dynamic equivalences reversal, that when we come back next time and start with Book 13, it is the Trojans who have to be fended off from the citadel of the Greek fleet. It's really a brilliant reversal. That's the section, Book 12, that Fagles rightly calls the Trojans storm the rampart. So I want to return again to this emphasis on this notion of the tension between worldly goods and imperishable fame, of your future renown, because it's going to matter so much about what it is going to take to get Achilles to fight again. And I say again that you might think that the theme of the Iliad is the destruction or the winning of destruction of Troy or the winning of a battle. It's not. It ends well before that's resolved. People in the audience would know how it was resolved. They wouldn't need to see it narrated. It ends with the funeral of Hector, and I'll talk more about that at our fourth meeting. But the theme of the Iliad is the wrath of Achilles. The Greeks are very interested in the median way. The whole of the enterprise of Greek literature and mythology is to try to find a place for humanity between the gods, who are powerful and merciful, but petty and inconsistent, and the beasts and the animals, the monsters, who are capable of ferocity that is absolutely inhuman. It's worth noting that a lot of Greek monsters are actually amalgams of animals that already exist and are put together, a woman with a head of snakes and composites of different animals. The word monster comes from a word that really means a showing, demonstration, the mon in demonstration, the equipment, equipment is the wrong word, but the very showy holder of the host in Catholic churches is called the monstrance, a showing. A monster was what farmers called an animal that was born deformed, and it was a monstrosity because somebody was showing you a message. If you had a pig with 3 heads, something was wrong and somebody was telling you. It always meant something. And then it became extended metaphorically to people who could be monstrous. But Greek literature is concerned about how, although we are like gods, that we can be merciful and kind, we are not immortal. And although we are like the monsters and the beasts, and that we're capable of terrible cruelty and lack of empathy, we are actually human beings. And what Greek literature attempts to do is, where is the middle ground for human beings who are better than the animals and the monsters, and not as great as the god, but in their own way better than either. And one of the ways it does that in the Iliad is suggest that as great as Achilles is, this great hero who's going to give his life for the cause, he is petty and brooding and gets angry because his honor has been besmirched by his having his war prize taken by somebody who is higher up in rank than he is. He's a bad soldier. He's a bad Greek. Ultimately, at the beginning of the poem, he's a bad man. And the whole trajectory of the poem is, how are we going to get Achilles out of his tent? So before I stop, I wanted to say that a good example of the concern for gnosis and fame is the recognition for Hector that he's already home. He's not on a mission to return home. The most he can hope for is to win, and he knows that he's fated not to win. He knows that he is almost certain to die. So the most he can hope for is to die well. And he says in book 7, lines 101 following, this is on page 217, He says, someday one will say, one of the men to come, steering his oar-swept ship across the wine-dark sea, there's the mound of a man who died in the old days, one of the brave whom glorious Hector killed. So they will say someday, and my fame will never die. The casualness of that somebody will be sailing and see a funeral mound of one of the many men I killed who died in the old days, one of the brave whom glorious Hector killed. There's that balance of heroism of those songs. So they will say someday, and my fame will never die. Once again, that never dying isn't the imperishable of certain things you'll see later in the poem. It's a different kind of expression. But that is a very, very high premium for both the Greeks and the Trojans to win glory or renown. Again, even though your translator may use a slightly different word. They want both the time, the material good for status while they're alive, and they want the kleos, the renown that will survive them after they're dead, because when they're dead, there's nothing. That's very ancient Greek. So I'm going to pause there only because I feel as I go on, even though there's more and more I can say, I fear that you may have more and more questions. And I realize that as useful as it is to answer questions offline, that is online when you email me, other people in this webinar are not hearing that answer. So I'm going to turn now to Michael to say if he has a question that he thinks would be a good question for everyone to hear, or especially a question that engages some of the things I've said so far, I'd be happy to do that now.
Great, thanks, Mark. Once again, that was really excellent presentation. I actually have a question from last time. It's you mentioned in your introductory comments, and you mentioned the number of chapters corresponding to the letters, and you referred to Joyce with Ulysses. I'm just curious, the same way that Joyce wrote a masterpiece, being inspired, and use that word, you're being inspired by the Odyssey, and in some ways relating it to the Odyssey, however you want to phrase that. Has any modern writer done something analogous with the Iliad?
I don't know, and it's not a question that interests me. I don't mean that in a disrespectful way, but there's so many other things to talk about inside the poem, inside what I've been talking about, the language of the poem, the structure of the poem, that to talk about other writers now, I feel would be a digression. The main reason why Joyce was so infatuated with Homer was not because the Odyssey reveals a whole lot about Ulysses. I talked about that last year, and there's something there, but he wanted to be the greatest writer of the modern age, and so he wanted to emulate the greatest model of the classical age.
Got it.
That's why.
So someone is asking, could you explain again what amphitheton meant?
Yeah, so aphiton, it's a strange word with a strange pronunciation. Aph gets the stress, and then thetan is the word imperishable in the literal sense of something that will not die. So in a later lecture, we will encounter an artifact that was fashioned by a god out of immortal materials, and it can actually not die. It will not die. And that word is reserved for only a handful of times by Homer in the Iliad, because he means it literally, Homer does. This thing that was fashioned cannot die, it cannot be destroyed. But the Greeks constantly talk about imperishable, and Homer uses other words. I have no Greek, I couldn't tell you what the words are. But in the same way, when someone says, oh, in the words of the immortal Mark Twain, well, newsflash, Mark Twain is dead. He's been dead a long time. He was decidedly mortal. We all know that. But we use immortal metaphorically. Homer is not going to use aphiton metaphorically when he uses it. It's too important. only things associated with the gods will never ever die. But the men in the poem, the warriors in the poem, use immortal, imperishable, the way that we use immortal in our own life. And it's interesting how much the register of language matters. Many, many times in the poem, when someone says they really want to go home, Homer is not using the word nostoi. He's using the word flee or depart or move because he doesn't think it's actually a noble mission. They're not looking to complete their fate. They're looking to desert. And the register in Greek is much more varied than the register in English.
Okay. Okay, so here's a question from Mike Hess. What caused the transition, I guess the transition in the work, what caused the transition from using similes to using metaphors?
Well, it's not so much that it happens in the work, I want to say. It's more a change over the course of literary history. I can't say that this is very well informed. It's a kind of seat of my pants, but if you're an early worker in poetry, and the Greek word poet or poetry literally means to make, poem, P-O-E-I-N, is making of something. If you're a craftsman, you want to make sure that the thing you're crafted has your hallmark, literally something to say, look what I made. And the way poets can do that is by saying, I'm going to give you comparison markers. So you know that when I say, this is like a mother bird, so am I, you see in the like and so that I've called to your attention this terrific simile of birds and females that I'm using about myself to tell you how angry and degraded I feel, how degraded you are, like little birds looking to take morsels away from me. Those early artisans, like the people who would inscribe something about their own personality in a Renaissance painting down in a corner, there might be a little image of somebody and you'd say, oh, that's the painter's brother or something like that. As people became more and more fluent in the language of comparison, they were more comfortable with creating metaphors that were striking and not worrying that you had to say, oh, I missed that. Again, a simile should not be missed because it has markers. A metaphor can be missed because, again, as I said last time, if someone says you're a pig and nobody knows exactly what a pig is, you don't know that that's a metaphor. It could be that a person actually is a pig from the Philadelphia pigs, I think I mentioned, or he got closed out of the Royal Brotherhood of Elks, so now he's a pig, capital P-I-G. Similes and metaphors are in the same relation to each other as an allusion and a reference. A reference says, look at me, I'm telling you that this is like that thing in Hamlet. An allusion just says something's rotten in the state of Denmark, and either you know that it's from Hamlet or you don't. So as artists became more comfortable with their audience being more informed and less worried about putting a mark of comparison on their similes and metaphors, they got more, they got easier with using metaphors. I think that's generally true.
Great. Someone is asking if you could match up some of the main heroes with their main adjectives again. Odysseus, comic. Why comic? Achilles, tragic. Any others?
Okay, so it's not so much their adjectives as the genres that they're in. So let's start with Odysseus, and I'll be simple for the sake of clarity. A comedy is not a ha-ha work. It's a work that says in the fullness of times, things get better. If you wait long enough, it gets better. In a situation comedy, it's 30 minutes. In the Odyssey, it's 10 years. But eventually, things work out. And the working out in comedies are almost always involve a marriage. And you can say that Odysseus essentially is re-wed by the end of the poem, or some cultural gain. You get the will, you find out the secret ingredient, you get some kind of secret revealed to you, and he returns to his homeland and his reign and gains back his family and his kingdom. It's a decidedly comic work, the Odyssey. The Iliad has two heroes, Achilles, who's the tragic hero, partly because he can't get out of his own way, partly because he's caught in this knot where he can't have both things. Either he goes home and is forgotten, he stays, is destroyed, has fame, and never gets home. That's tragic. When George Eliot says, in a marvelous essay I recommend to all of you, if you have never read or can't remember the Antigone, just read a brief summary of it before you read this extraordinary essay. But she says in that play by Sophocles, Antigone has a brother who fought against the city-state that she is now living in with her father, Oedipus's brother, Creon, who has said that anyone who fights against the state cannot be treated with burial honors. And one of her brothers fought on the side of the state and one fought on the other side. And so her problem is she wants to go outside the city walls and give her dead brother, the traitor, funeral rites. And her uncle, her king, has said that if she does that, she'll be exiled, a fate that to the Greeks was worse than death. And the problem is that you can love your brother, even though he's a traitor, and you can love your uncle, even though he is a heartless king, but you can't both bury your brother and not bury your brother. That's the heart of tragedy. You can hold what Keats called cognitive dissonance. You can hold two competing ideas in your head. He's a despicable person. I find him utterly charming. But you can't both do and not do something because the world is limited. The conflict for Antigone is she's right to want to bury her brother from the point of view of her being a sister, and she's right to want to honor her uncle from the point of view of being a citizen, because you can be both a citizen and a sister, but you can't both do and not do something. The way to think about Hamlet, I hope you find this little insertion educational, is not that the conflict in that magnificent play is between the prince and his murderous uncle. That would not be tragedy. The conflict in Hamlet is between Hamlet and Hamlet. He says to Horatio late in the play, in my heart, there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. That's why it's tragic. By contrast, Hector, who is given a lot of attention and respect and value in this poem about a Greek victory by a Greek poet, Hector is the pathetic, that is the hero that our heart breaks for. Maybe it's easier than using the word that has other meaning. He's the heartbreaking hero because he is doomed to die, and yet he is an honorable person. He is a prince of Troy. His father, Priam, is more kingly in every way than Agamemnon. He is burdened, Hector is, with a brother who is, again, I need a Greek word, a jerk. Paris is the young brother who can't get out of his own way, and for the sake of a beautiful woman, he's threatening the world and making a lot of great literature. Hector is caught in the pathos, the heartbreaking nexus of a different kind of situation that is not tragic because it doesn't fit the pattern that I described now, maybe at too much length, but I hope that was helpful.
Thanks, Mark. So someone is asking, aside from providing entertainment for them, what did the gods think of this struggle?
What did the gods think of
What did the gods think of this struggle aside from it providing entertainment for them?
I'm dismayed to think that somebody's asking me what the gods of Greek literature thought. I can answer in 2 words, beats me. Don't know. I want to say that I know that for many people, and certainly for young readers, which I understand, part of the fun of Greek literature is recognizing the systems of the gods. And they were so powerful in their depiction that the Romans basically just appropriated all of them made certain name changes and sometimes characteristic changes. But I find a discussion of the gods the least interesting part of the Iliad. And since it was I who Michael invited, you're going to get that from me. I do think that the way to see the gods in the Iliad, and I responded to this in an email from one of our patrons, who I expect is here again this evening, is two ways. One is when Athena shows up, it's to let us know that the warrior who is nearby has gotten or needs wisdom. When Ares makes an appearance, it's because the Greek or Trojan nearby has gotten his warrior-like nature back again. Their personification. Whether the people at the time of Achilles believe in the gods, it's probably likely that Homer, whoever they were, did not actually believe in the gods in the sense of actual credence. And the other way to think of the gods is that they're entertaining as great petty people. The bickering and the fighting and getting on the right or wrong side, it makes for thrilling literature. And I'm not trying to be at all demeaning about the grandeur of the epic. If Poseidon has it in for you and you have to spend a long time on a boat getting home, that's serious business. I do not mean to say that that's not crucial, but you don't need to believe in a god of the sea to believe that getting home across the ocean is terrifying. That's my point. So one way to think of them is that they do involve a larger realm, a higher realm of bickering and drama. They don't actually fight with each other because that is, they don't combat physically with each other because there's nothing to be won. I find it much more interesting to think about how, again, Greek literature is constantly saying the things for human beings to concentrate on is that middle band below the gods and above the beasts.
Well, here's another. I will dare to ask you another God-related question. Someone has said, might Achilles' petulant, self-centered tantrum actually be seen as, quote, godlike, because that's how the gods are behaving in the story? Might it be a sly way of sassing the gods, as if to say, this is what they're really like?
Well, not to me, but I want to make it clear. My way of talking to other people about literature is not to say I win and you lose or vice versa. I think a great work of literature can be hospitable to many different points of view. His rage is far too serious. Its effect on people. He's going to lose a beloved friend and maybe more than a friend because he's been in a snit. And there are many heroic men who have died. And a lot of grief has been caused by his rage, just as a lot of grief has been caused by Paris's libido. There's nothing godlike about either of those two things. And I see we're over time, so I'm going to thank Michael again for the invitation and for emceeing, all of you for your attention and attendance despite the good weather. And I hope not to see you, but for you to see me next time. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks very much, Mark. And we'll see everybody next week. Remember, there were a couple of loose questions at the very end. Feel free if you want to send them to Mark. If you don't have his email address, just let me know. I'll tell you what it is. And otherwise, we'll see you all next Wednesday. Thanks very much.
Stay well.
Good night, everybody.